an enormous amount of energy and insights to putting this exhibition together. Stephen works primarily as an artist, so he brought also a lot of thinking that he's been digesting since he started making art. He's worked with painting and film and as well as photography. So I think you will see his sensibility in this exhibition. I also want to point out that his Steidl book is available for sale in the bookstore. Also this mural here, I think Stephen will talk about that, but that's kind of a teaser or offers many clues about how he thinks about photography and image making. So I want to just personally really thank Stephen for what he brought to this project. He was amazingly tenacious and inventive. There are many challenges to putting exhibitions together, and I appreciated everything that you've brought to this. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that we will start, obviously, in this room, and then probably spend most of the time in the next room. And please, if you feel like you want to sit for a bit, just grab a chair. You can carry a chair around for the seniors of us. So please, Stephen.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming. I guess what I'd like to start to talk about is the layers of thinking that the exhibition rests upon. Obviously, it's an exhibition about photography, since everything represented here in some way relates to film art photography. But that said, the choice of artists has a lot to do with how each artist has hybridized or transformed their practice to reveal more than just the primary recognition for which we've given them. So the contemporary artists involved in the show, Elad Lazary, who has portraits in the other room, and this one double portrait here in the middle, is an artist who uses photography, but is quite clear that the objects he makes don't have to be considered anything other than works of art that could have a sculptural presence, a photographic presence, and then something else. The film project in here, from an artist in London named Rina Islam, again is so multi-layered in terms of its references to photography, to film, to the disappearance of film, to the difficulty of making such a presentation, an artwork like that. So she also represents the contemporary relationship to what I want to try to reveal with the other artists who are either dead, in this case Walker Evans, Sigmar Polke, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and Gerhard Richter, still alive and still making work that tries to move back and forth between the interstitial zones of painting and photography. But then the exhibition is about a lot of other things. Like every exhibition, there's these other things that reveal themselves later. And the one thing I noticed that was happening in putting it together with Helga is that we, through finding loans that we could, we found that there was colors that emerged. So it's also a colorist exhibition. Red one side, green the other, which is just very simple stuff that ends up becoming a rhythm or a syncopation for which we can start to adore the works, at least I do. So the exhibition then has another layer, and that is all the artworks in here I really like. I guess as an artist curating an exhibition, albeit there might be a didactic and or a pedagogical function, for me it's just pleasure. And the pleasure is kind of important, because without it, one doesn't move past a lot of the boundaries of theory and talk and dialogic thinking. So I guess I present this room first. In here, we have 3 magazine works by the American artist Walker Evans, who we know quite well, or most of us know quite well, through photographs as a kind of social history of, say, sharecroppers and laborers in the southern United States in the 30s, late 20s and early 30s. But the exhibition for me started with a conversation of a friend of mine in London who is working on and has almost finished the project about Walker Evans and the magazine work. And that conversation began with how experimental Walker Evans really was in the late 30s. and what that experimentation revealed for him in terms of how he could take his practice, which was a very dependent journalistic relationship, albeit he subverted it always. He was always able to put his voice, a very strong voice, inside a magazine or present work that was distinctly his own. What this exhibition, again, relates to very specifically is a project that he called the Unposed Portrait from 1962, which he put into Bazaar magazine for the first time. Portraits that had been shot in 1938 and 41, or 38 to 41, of surreptitiously made images of people in the subway in New York. Now, I guess to us now, surreptitious behavior or surreptitious photographs is nothing to think about in terms of its subversion or experimentation. We've experienced that a lot. But what was happening in 1938 to 41, probably for Walker Evans, was how to break free from only making things that would fit into an editorial assignment, how to make a work of art that had no purpose, no function. Maybe just something that could link to the pictorial history of the past that he was interested in. Walker Evans, being a person who was an exceptional writer and exceptionally interested in the literary past of, say, the 19th century, he probably always wanted to be a writer, and probably his photographs bear evidence of his very strong discursive relationship to other forms of art. That said, there is a text in the Unposed Portrait that was, for me, the kind of release point where I suddenly thought, maybe I could take my adoration and my admiration for Walker Evans and think about how experimental he must have been in terms of thinking and relate it to now, and relate it to photography now, and then relate it to art now. Because one of the disappointments for me is entering museums and seeing what I find really beautiful artworks stuck in their time, curated in their epochs, not curated for now. And so, I guess for me to put a Walker Evans next to a work that exists now, that is not canonized or not put into a kind of category of a museum reception, is a way to release the experimental nature of all these artworks together and create, very commonly we call it convergence. Thereby the energies of these artworks could come together to say something about now, to describe how modernist idioms, modernist approaches to making art have actually influenced so many things straight through photography, painting. So that what I call the disruptive nature of photography, and I describe it as a kind of beautiful relationship between painting and photography, is such that this disruption for Walker Evans was a way out in order to create an autonomous work of art that had no purpose, an autonomous practice that would have no purpose other than his own, and that he would continue on after 38, 41, and in 1962 he does this magazine layout, and then in 1966 he produces Many Are Called with James Agee. So that's where that spirit comes from, wanting to bring Walker Evans now. In my studio, I work often with many pictures at once, just sort of tacked to a board. And that board is, it's just a working surface, and it's horizontal. And this work surface I've literally documented on a day that represented to me an assembly of pictures that could be an atmosphere around my thinking of the exhibition. So the text in the catalog or the pamphlet is maybe a little bit more academic and straightforward. This represents, in picture form, various other pictures as well that inform my thinking. For instance, we don't have Brancusi's in the exhibition, but Constantin Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor who worked and lived in Paris, very important for me and very important for many artists. I would even say that conceptual uses of photography, that people like Bruce Nauman and a lot of other people would never admit it, but probably the atmospheres of Brancusi and the atmospheres of other artists like him allowed those people to think about the studio and why photography could enter the studio and be an experimental phase of their production. An artist like Bowles, who, to quote another friend of mine, is probably a great texturist, and his relationship and his use of photography is still very original, and I would say even vanguard, even compared to things that are made today. And then the the inferences go on. Luigi Giri, another polka on the right-hand side, a few things of mine, and maybe an Adjay. I love this particular Adjay picture here. And then just a journalistic photograph, anonymous. So that's just a kind of background picture for that. Now the next thing I wanted to do in this exhibition was try to relate this piece in here, this Runa Islam 35mm, just under 3-minute loop, red monochromatic piece to Walker Evans in terms of thinking about the studio. For if Walker Evans imagined that the subway would become his laboratory, a way to find portraits where portraiture was not considered to be the genre of choice, then the darkroom, which Runa Islam is literally taking her camera into to make a surreptitious unfolding of a glass negative printing in a developer tray. So the film starts, and I think if you haven't seen it, it would be great to see it before we go in the other room. Again, Larger is flashing a fragment, a close-up of the broken piece of glass negative, then another piece of it, then the whole image in a negative form. Then finally it goes into the developer, into the tray, and you see the water. And then in the tray you just see the red monochrome, so the performance is going on. Then after that you will see a bubble just start to go across the image as it's being formed. The image becomes formed, it reaches a stasis point where you then recognize the image. It starts to vibrate a little bit, or it starts to become something that you're conscious of. And it's an image of two dogs feasting on a horse. It's a historical image from Tehran, and I think someone told me the other night that in fact it's a very recognizable piece of architecture. So that use of history, that use of that glass neg, is able to transcend all of the kind of nostalgia and difficulties of taking a historical picture by transforming it into a contemporary existence. Now, using the red monochrome is also another way of creating a mood and a coloration and a relationship to something that resembles a painting, resembles an atmosphere. So it's beyond installation, it's beyond all these things, it's a tableau in a sense. So that we have the 35mm projector, which is able to actually capture and resolve that much color. So for if you had anything less than 35mm, you would be resolved to experience less color. Now that sounds kind of odd, but it's kind of true. So there is something about the analog medium that this particular project requires, because when you start to put it together and you think, my goodness, it's so difficult setting up a 35mm projector, so difficult to do all these things and aim it on the screen and get it feeling right. But then you start to realize how exceptional the behavior is of that particular projection, and you'll notice that the color is quite intense. Now that intensity and that space that she creates, where you're only seeing just the water and the image coming forth, I relate back to the Walker Evans again, the laboratory of the subway. And then the bubble passing across is our realization of what's going on. And then at that point, go in here and we start to realize that portraiture is another layer of the exhibition, whereby we recognize perhaps the brutality of that image, but also the eternalness of brutality, the eternalness of our states of being, our being in time. And then we can move into this room, and being in time now comes into a conversation of what people's faces look like. Resemblance, knowledge, understanding of our fellow persons by looking at them, and how then to relate that back to the Walker Evans. So I think what would be interesting is to, if you haven't seen that, look at that once, recognize its parts, and then we can meet in that room.
Excellent.
Here with the dissolution of the image. In other words, the image has now reached such a point in the developer bath that it's dying, that it's literally fading from existence, from where it had just come. So here is one of the exceptional parts where Runa Islam is able to transcend even what a film projection is about. We actually have the light coming in here. It's very important for her that this extra ambient light is in here, so we recognize the object of the screen, we recognize that the image is dying. This is the beginning, with the flashes again. I had a chance to witness that piece, which I guess the Ring of Islam piece is important because it was also very early in my choice of wanting to form an exhibition around. The first time I saw it was in Switzerland a few years ago, and I realized it was the best thing in the fair, and the best for what reasons? Well, it just has so much presence, and it's so delicate, and it's so multi-layered, and it's so sophisticated, yet it's short and simple. And it's beautiful, which is hard to beat. But that piece, again, has a structure to it, which I really like. And that structure, I think, I've tried to echo in the rest of the exhibition. And it is once you reach the palpable understanding of what that image is, it's a stasis point. You have now come to recognize the two dogs feasting on a horse. You've gone through the passages and the structures to understand maybe how you got there. And then at that point, you probably ask yourself, okay, what next? Once we reach that. And the next, I like because it's a kind of surprise that she would collapse time and turn it into the disintegration and the literal destruction of her own image, of her own piece. And that destruction is also, for me, another metaphor for the disruption of photography in art. For if we cannot escape depiction, and we cannot escape kind of realism realism in relationship to art, then this disruptive influence is probably one of the most fruitful and or hopeful experiences that art could have ever expected or hoped for, and that is photography's invention. So in this room, we have Gerhard Richter overpainted photographs, Walker Edwards subway portraits, a portrait by Elad Lazary, another portrait here, Sigmar Polka's abstraction, but literally they're not abstraction. They are images of uranium exposed to 4x5 transparency. So also in the way that Ring of Islam's piece disintegrates, here we have the sinister, unpredictable characteristic of what uranium exposed to film would look like. So that sinister quality is recorded in a beautiful way, and in this room, I think, start to look like portraits, or resemble something like heads, in the way that painting would. Either a Baselitz or some other kind of painter who would be interested in making a multiple like that. So the green echoes the Islam, I've said that. The green's also represented here. Gerhard Richter is present for these images, these three works, the portrait out there, overpainted, the cityscape, the room, are small pieces for Gerhard Richter. Obviously, this is an artist who we cannot forget has brought us since the late or early 60s, shall I say, black and white, journalistic, redacted photo paintings. Paintings literally made from black and white appropriated photographs, or his own photographs. But in the early 60s, Gerhard Richter obviously interested in how appropriation could come to inform painting, how photography, not just any photography, but journalism. And that transformation is something that would take him 20 years to figure out how to go from popular culture or kind of pop culture relation to appropriation to something much more specific. And that was something that came about in 1988 when Gerhard Richter painted a cycle of 15 paintings called October 1977, and that literally is the taking of 15 images from press culture, and they are images in various periods of time of the incarceration of the Red Army faction in Germany. So the incarceration meaning the arrest of the people who were involved in these so-called state terrorist acts, their transference to Sternheim in Stuttgart, and their deaths. So those images are quite beautiful, and that cycle also impressed me. In 2002, I had a chance to see them in Frankfurt in the museum, and that's left a resonance for me in terms of what his work actually could exist for us now. So the Richters here represent an in-between of many kinds of his work, and that is, he's also responsible for having made a very large project called Atlas. And Atlas is many frames about like this size, made of drawings, graphics, and photographs of his own and appropriated photographs of everything from 1960 forward. And it's a project that continues. So these externalities, or released from the project of Atlas photographs, often made, overpainted, given as gifts to people, or represented in smaller exhibitions, also see this way to this exhibition as the in-between space between photography and painting, unfinished is part of the project of this exhibition, which I like, is I would describe Walker Evans' subway portraits as an unfinished project. It's never ending. It ended, but it kind of is never ending. The Sigmar Polke experimental nature of his work, as evidenced here, relates to his vast body of painting, which we in some ways know as a very German take and a very ironic take on popular culture and on pop art. So his early paintings were kind of jokes at times. The idea of painting in its most reduced and pulled back, but yet funny. And then he would progress into just trying to incorporate, I don't know, alchemy, chemical experiments, vast canvases with fields of chemical scorching and torching, and then he would deal with fire, and then he would make vast array of black and white silver gelatin photographs that he would then throw on the floor and stamp on and cut up and exhibit. And so he was a real experimenter. So photography for Sigmar Polke is a way to witness all of the other energy that he hoped to incorporate in his painting and maybe couldn't. So Polke is very interested in Goya. And so Francisco Goya, for him, was this bridge between the older world, pre-Enlightenment, with the modern world. So it was Goya who was able to describe the hypocrisy of the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment was bringing us something fresh and new and absolving us of all the terrors of the past. But Goya said, well, yes, in the Enlightenment, that's great, but you're also witnessing great terror and great violence. So we have photography is for Goya, his capriccios. His etchings would be the kind of multi-produced, multi-etched, multi-made thing in the way that Polke would be making photographs. So it's also nice in the background is that this exhibition is Goya somewhere. So if we move and we think of how the Lazary fits in, Lazary is an artist who I've described already once as someone who's interested in not saying he's necessarily making photographs, but just making artistic objects. He may have conceived that these portraits, the way I see them, I don't know, I see them kind of like Holbeins. The last Holbein exhibition I saw was these very discreet, small, very studied, perfectly lit portraits of people that we know. These are anonymous portraits. Lazary's been known to make a portrait of someone through several sheets of glass, I don't know how many, but let's say a lot, then take the negative, rephotograph it, then print it, then take that print and make a lithograph. So here we're witnessing two lithographs, meaning screen printed onto paper. And at the beginning you ask yourself, why so many layers of representation and experimentation in order to accomplish a portrait? But when you actually look at these exquisite things, you really start to understand that the distancing, the retrieval of the image from far away, but then brings it right forward in some kind of immediacy that is hard to retrace unless you go through all these layers. The very matte-ness of the image, the color, and the lighting comes through in a kind of odd way when you take that much process and add it to it. And they're glazed in a way too that's also very important. It was, I think, Francis Bacon who would never let a painting out of the studio unless it was glazed. So as a kind of way of saying glazing must exist, Lazary's very good at trying to figure out how that could work with a work of art. Here's another Sigmar Polke. This polka represents, the double exposure, obviously. We have a nugget, a kind of unformed something that reveals its reflection of light over top of a street image. Now, Polke is very well known for just making underexposed, crappy photographs, literally, and then making even more impoverished and negligent prints. And out of that negligence is the poetry, because negligence is also is an empathy. Because if you're negligent in the making of an art, you can often come across all sorts of other ways of thinking about it before you're finished. And so Polke, kind of the master of negligence. But when you have a convergency again, where you start to have also someone who was not very good at printing their photographs, by the way, Walker Evans. But in this case, his images are so beautiful that you can't really print them badly, which is kind of how great works of art can withstand any kind of production. When you have a double portrait like that, next to that, you start to, maybe, this is my hope, start to feel that there are parallels drawn between a working experience of an artist like Walker Evans and the very experimental nature of Sigmar Polke. Now around the corner is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who I just sort of recently discovered his photographs about 5 years ago. When I was making my book, I was going through a library, and I'd always considered Kirchner to be, that 20s Weimarian painter of interest to me. And I've seen many of his paintings in the Städel Museum in Frankfurt that I really adore. And the reason I've always really liked his paintings is they always felt to me they had a documentary behind, that they were not just conjured and put together in order to create an atmosphere of what was going on in the 20s. They were also literally describing what he saw. A very 19th century, even 18th century exercise brought forward through all of the should we say, the complexities of the 20s, the transition from the First World War to the Second World War. I think that those were very fruitful but difficult times for artists. And Kirchner, these pictures in this exhibition here, represent his domicile in Davos in Switzerland. And in Switzerland it was the place for which he took refuge in a kind of bucolic hideout, where he would invite people, they would do performances, they would do whatever else they would do in terms of drinking and having fun. But nevertheless, it was a very important stage set for him. So very much like Brancusi in Paris in his studio, who would spend decades rearranging his beautiful sculptures on plinths in arrangements for which the perspective and spatial relationships must be important and then recorded in photographs. Kirchner would also, in Davos and in Berlin, make the studio or the home into an experimental place. Now this is nothing really new for us now in this installation craziness that we live in today. The kind of resemblance, making of atmospheres is something we see all the time. But there is something interesting about seeing how and where it comes from in its modernist idiom. And Kirchner, of course, sadly enough, was an artist who was labeled as degenerate by the Nazis, and 700 of his artworks were confiscated and destroyed. So these photographs represent that kind of beautiful melancholy in this exhibition, which is that the provisional point in Runa Islam's picture, right when you recognize his two dogs eating a horse, you realize that there's something beautiful about that melancholy, and then it disappears and it dies. In the same way that Kirchner disappears, in the same way that Richter recognizes the RAF and the political ambiguity that would relate to painting if it ever could, that history painting would have one last hurrah in 1988. I don't think we've seen history painting since then. And that Polke, whose relationship to Goya would also harken back to the difficulties of and the hypocrisy of the Enlightenment. So again, I'm kind of treading out more layers of the exhibition, but definitely melancholy in its aesthetic reception is something that I'm also interested in, and I think that Lasry also does it very well. What's the last things I can say? Yes, experimentation and provisionality. There's, in the text I wrote about the idea that an artwork, until it's been canonized, or until we attribute all these, I'd say, more boring descriptions of it, lives in this provisional world. And that the Walker Evans, not being published for 30 years, Walker Evans was very confident, obviously. He didn't need to publish it. He just held on to those pictures. I don't know how anybody could hold on to those pictures for 30 years, impossible. But anyway, he held on to them and then published them. And so they exist in this kind of transitory, provisional state, that they would have a metaphysical influence on him, that he must have known he had them, and that they would somehow influence the other things he made. So this provisionality that I'm very much interested in as an artist, and how artworks can shed meaning, but then not take any meaning on for quite some time, but then eventually become something that we enjoy and experience. That's all I have to say.
So, please ask Stephen questions now or informally. I'm sure you'll stick around for a while. And there is a brochure with his text in it by the entryway. So I was just curious, Stephen, how this might, working on this project, how this might impact your own work.
A vacation. I'm not sure right this minute.
Because it certainly comes out of your sensibility that you've made visible in your art, but I just wondered if the experiment for you also of putting things into a room and how they speak to one another might make you think a bit differently about your images or how they work as together. If this was.
Well, I guess for me, I'm very much interested in, I mean, we live in an interesting time such that artists can either have a studio or not. And so, there's neither way is less interesting than the other. But what I am interested in is what comes out of studios. And that the avowal, just saying, I'm going to have a studio is already a kind of act. And out of that comes so many things, and we can go and have so many divergent paths. So I guess for me the exhibition was interesting to think about how someone like Walker Evans, or even how any person's working with materials that they can actually use in a mobile way. In other words, if you just have a Leica or you just want to write poems, you actually don't need a studio. But then if you were to add a studio to that, what would it do? And it doesn't have to be palatial or grand or important, it just could be a space. So, and it could be actually a metaphysical space. So for instance, Walker Evans could have just thought, maybe the subway is my new place for now. And could be just your own. So I'm interested in that, and I don't know what more else to say about that, but that's maybe something that still interests me. And it's Sunday, and it's sunny outside. Oh, sorry.
What was your genesis for that concept? And, could you just speak to how that came about and how you kind of ordered and decided on who would be in the show?
Good question, I guess. The Walker Evans is definitely the beginning in trying to digest for myself why he would wait 30 years. And in that 30 years, what transpired in his thinking. That when they finally do come out, he makes it a subversion in a magazine, just present them, albeit that's an era when you don't present photographs in the same way that we do today, but his first inclination was in the same habitual, expected format, which was magazine work. So he somehow felt that he was going to use the same place but subvert it. So that for me was interesting. So then, how to think about other artworks which are interested in, artists who are interested in that kind of surreptitious behavior. So the Runa Islam, for me, it's not surreptitious, she sets it up, but she proposes what would happen if the camera in our mind, we were able to labor to forget that camera was there, and that, like cinema, we were able to enter the work. So then I was thinking about another artist, Giovanni Anselmo, who made this very large silkscreen piece, and he was an artist living, still alive, who lived in Italy, a part of the Art Povera tradition of making art. He made this one piece called Enter the Work, and that's just an image of him running into a field. So literally you have this very large silkscreen image, and he's just in the middle of it running into it like a piece of cinema. And like a Pasolini film, it's just that small figure. Literally ready to disappear, but it can't disappear because there's no horizon. So you literally have to enter the work. So then the Islam is like, you have to enter it. The Walker Evans is you have to go into the subway, you literally enter it through these portraits. And that the emergence of that experimentation is what I was interested in. And then Polka for me, I'm always just, I'm very interested in showing only Polka photographs too, that the idea that if you bring in his paintings, something else happens too. I like the idea that you only can coexist for a period of time with his experiments in photography, because they do release all of the energies that he's also exuding and imbibing in his painting. And then Lasry, I've always thought that Lasry is one artist who works today. I just think he's got a lot of things figured out in terms of not being too specific, not being too ambiguous, knowing that artworks need have an aesthetic that people can be drawn to. So I feel the work's very generous. I guess maybe I'm also interested in generosity in art. I find one of the big things about conceptual uses of photography is I found a lot of it for the last X number of years to be very ungenerous. and I know very rigorous and academically interesting, I guess, but the ungenerousness of 60s to the 80s in terms of photography I found less than compelling. So, because I tried to put my finger on for a long time what I was not interested in, and so what I like about Lasry is that kind of new generosity that I think a lot of younger artists are maybe interested in, and leaving some of the stuff behind. I'm definitely interested in leaving some of that behind. So I think part of the convergence in here was also about generosity and Ron.
Can you go into some detail about
How much detail?
About some of the Gerhard Richter photo paintings, the more dramatic ones, how he created those, particularly like the one with a lot of horizontal streaking, lady walking down the stairs.
Well, Richter paintings, photo paintings are, I mean, they're literally made, so it's hard to say exactly how he would do it. I obviously would say that he projects, or he projected, or he would somehow come up with a way to replicate the compositional and proportional structure of the photograph as it relates to the rectangles that you paint on. And then you can literally put the various tones and colors in, and then I guess it reaches some painted point where you blur it with a big squeegee. And that blurring is done, it has to be done at a certain point. There has to be enough representation established, enough illustrative quality of the image you're trying to make, whether it be a barn in color, or whether it be a Stuka fighter, or whatever it is, a car. And then at that point, streaks. Now, very early on, the works are very fast and abbreviated. So I think you block things in. In that sense too, he's also working very light and then very dark, and then he'll do the midtones and then it's great. Because if you try to go in too much accentuated painting, like really trying to paint everything, it will not maintain its graphicness through the white. So I think there's also a kind of approach which is kind of interesting there. It's about stopping before you've reached the end. Hi.
Can you elaborate a little bit about what you mean about generosity? What is that generosity that wasn't?
I guess I'm being very vague when I say that, but there was something about. There was a period of time, I think, when minimal art was being made and arrived and received, conceptual uses of photography, conceptual art, a lot of stuff that I adore too, but a lot of it was made also to retreat from a lot of areas of over-sincerity or too much generosity that was maybe exuded by certain artists in their work. So for instance, gesture, too much gesture, exaggerated persona, things being too, kind of maybe too intimate, that the 60s, the late 50s and early 60s, if you think of the abstract expressionism in New York, of course, the ultimate force of it. Also, at a certain point, young artists must have thought, oh my God, I do not want to be involved with that much expression. That I want to reduce the amount of marks that I make in order to retreat from trying to have everybody ascribe meaning to what I'm doing immediately. So the kind of immediate reception of the work must have been, I want to get away from that. So AbX must have been a big influence on what young artists wanting to use photography would do. To retreat to a kind of abstract state. If you think about conceptual art and you think about conceptual use of photography, it's kind of abstraction. It is an abstract concept sitting in front of an object for which you have to maybe pass through this threshold of abstraction, abstract thinking, in order to understand what that artwork is saying. Maybe. So if you're not interested in the abstract thought, you're going to have trouble with the physical object. So, and I can name many examples, but so there was maybe a kind of understanding that by becoming less sincere and moving in some ways towards irony, one could get away with some of the problems that were becoming too heightened and too mannerist in the late 50s, early 60s. So, but that means there's also retreat in terms of generosity in some artists' part, not all, but some artworks might just be cold, close to inaccessible, but intelligent. And that doesn't mean that they're of lower value, or that they're less good. It just means that they, temperature-wise, they're colder. And there's been through the whole history of art, there's colder and warmer. Renaissance a bit warmer than other things, you know. And
So you're meaning that like expression is generous, expressionism is generous?
not always, but it can be.
I just find it peculiar, or I'm not sure about generosity as a term for.
It's a very
category.
artists would speak about artworks in that way. You wouldn't find a curator on the planet who would dare use that word. For a very good reason, is they can't really be explained away. But as an artist, you can honestly say when you walk into an exhibition, you can feel when there's generosity or not. And I know I'm going to leave it a bit ambiguous like that, because I think it's just something to ponder, and you can throw it away. It's just something that I think about. I think music is a good example, because music is hard to, in some ways, escape expression. Certainly Stockhausen is about retreating from that immediately overly generous relationship that music can offer. So if you return to Cage prepared piano, there's so many intervals for which you feel alienated from the progression of the piece, and in Stockhausen as well. And in new music, there's definitely a retreat from the basics, you know, just making something that a lot of people might be interested in listening to. So that's different than kind of populism. That's another thing. But yeah, definitely we have Philip Guston, and Stockhausen is very interested in Philip Guston. How does that work? Because Philip Guston is an artist who I would be very generous, but Stockhausen, not so much for me, but I'm still interested in his work, so it's colder temperature to me. Yeah.
I wonder if you'd care to speculate on the nature of some of the photography that's in the exhibition. You can kind of tell how you can read in the image itself how it's the process of its production.
Mm-hmm.
So you can, or it can be described to you, and because we know the mechanics of photography, we can kind of think about like how it was produced, and that can be somehow read in the image itself. And I'm wondering if you would care to speculate, maybe the Elad Lassery works point in that direction, about contemporary, maybe like through digital means or other means where you can't necessarily, the viewer can't necessarily comprehend how the image was, how the artist arrived at that final image.
Mm-hmm.
And whether there's a difference between the two. I read the generosity like that in terms of that, like that the viewer can kind of like understand and become involved in the production process of the artist themselves.
Yeah.
As opposed to other images that can be created maybe through photographic means, but that production isn't necessarily, you can't really read it in the image, and you're kind of left maybe at a certain distance to it, or?
I think it's a very good question. I think that for me is twofold, or it's bifurcated, such that I don't think we need to understand, I don't think anybody needs to understand the exact means of production, but what I do think is important is that there be a sense or a kind of metaphysical presence or a kind of ghost of it being made. So that the Lassery's, without having him in the room telling us exactly how these were made, or maybe he wouldn't even tell us. So I think you're right, between the digital and the analog, there is a kind of break. But I think some artists are trying to create false analog perception of the means production, even though they're using digital production. So they may leave that out and just say, oh, well, it's this and this. But actually there's a digital interstep.
Mm.
So we're not going to know that, and they might not reveal it. But it's just a kind of inevitability of now. But I think that the means of production thing is also what I write in the text is that that's also, we don't need to know it because we don't actually know how Walker Evans got so smart as to shoot those portraits in that way. Or what led Polka to say, I'm going to try to trace uranium today. So not a first step inclination in terms of photography, or in terms of art photography, shall we say. So I think that the magic, if we could call it, or the hidden reasons why something gets made, and then the means of production, I think it's enough that we can ascribe some things here and some things there and say it might be like this, and because we can't really know how a Francis Bacon is painted.
Maybe the generosity is related to means of production, or like the hand of the artist, and that to me then links to just the scale of the works, the intimacy, like the way you've laid out the show, and with the gaze, the kind of the orchestration of these gazes, and you're encouraged to make like an intimate encounter or reading. And the Walker Evans, I think, sort of synthesizes that, because they're both, it's a public situation, but there's this moment of the intersection of the private and the public, and that sets up this involvement that I would then link to generosity or intimacy, or the encounter is registered in that way.
Maybe it's also empathy as well, in the sense that even if you're working with appropriated materials, even if it's a photograph that's not yours, that somehow an empathy has been derived and made up in order to make the work of art. In other words, even a performance, even something that's so dematerialized requires a conceptual form of empathy in order to begin and end it, and conjure it for an audience, or conjure it even for yourself in the studio, so that without the empathy and maybe the generosity, that the work could sometimes retreats and hovers in a way that I'm not interested in. But definitely I think that Walker Evans, there are many portraits he made, but the ones that we actually see are the ones that waver in this very empathetic place that I think I dare say, great works of art enter into. So for me, the Lazaris, whether they're appropriated, whether he shot them, whatever they are, they exude empathy. And I think that's very important in terms of considering them as portraits as well, even if they're anonymous persons.
What would you say about the ability to a contemporary audience engaging a Lazari in that way, as opposed to Walker Evans, which we see, you can pick up any number of books, historical books, we're at art school, and we're very familiar with, if not particularly, we're very familiar with street photography, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s.
This exhibition is about defamiliarizing yourself with that. So this is about helping even I want to forget about those books and just concentrate on what is it like to have those two artworks side by side. Because I think I said earlier that the problem is the overly affirmative and overly familiarized world of seeing artworks in one way tend to numb you to them. So the idea of curatorially juxtaposing them, placing them side by side, is hopefully a way to break some of that bad habit.
I get that. I think that's great. I think I'm sort of pulling off the question almost on the process. When you look at something that may be digitally manipulated, we know something is that. We may not know exactly how, but it's usually composition, color, something. Whereas we don't necessarily take the time to bring that kind of perception to historical work.
Right.
So, yes, I get it. I'm just wondering. We can actually answer the question.
Yeah, I mean the problem is the attribution of older artworks being old and contemporary artworks being contemporary. It's a great construct for the continual machinations of a contemporary art world, that new artworks must be new and old must be old. But the fact of the matter is, when is old start? Is that 12 years ago? Is that so? If you can't address ageism, if you just try to take ageism out for the moment, and just have a dialogue with artists and forget about their dead or alive, or then some of these convergences can happen. But we are kind of a reproducing species, so we love being ageist even when we pretend we're not being ageist. So part of this exhibition is about de-aging some of those things. So the digital shenanigans, I don't even need to know. personally. Like, you know, I'm just sort of, if I can just look at it and it agrees with me in some screwed up way or interesting way, then it's enough for me. And I think that even Walker Evans, if he was alive today, would probably look at it and go, huh, that's what the evolution of portraiture is now. If you can still make a portrait today, and it can be as powerful as a Holbein, carry that through, but then present something about it now, that's kind of interesting. That doesn't happen very often. Because most people, you know, when you're teaching, you hand out these slides and you say, oh, you're going to do a still life for a portrait, and they're like, oh, you kidding? And you're like, no, I'm not kidding. Because we have examples that exist today that pretend to be non-traditional, pretend to be non-conventional, yet rest very heavily on the conventions of. And escaping them is less interesting than using them in a way. But again, that opens up a big bunch of questions.
This is something, actually, it's funny that you just should say this, because this is something I thought of before you made your statement just now. If these artists walked into this room today, obviously this is a fantasy or kind of arbitrary situation, and saw their work in this grouping, what they would think and how they could relate to the portrait work, say, of Walker Evans, or in that framework of when he did his work and what was going on politically and socially, to more conceptual or chemical kind of work, completely taken away from portrait work. If they would have, could relate to the work together, which is, I mean, it is a fantasy question, an arbitrary question, but it certainly relates to what you just now said, and something I had been thinking of before.
Well, I think artists sometimes fantasize about what dead artists would think about something. Not necessarily their own work, but just about something.
Or seeing their work with a contemporary or with a previous artist from years before, how they could see their own artwork relating to that, and not knowing, of course, how that artist would think of their artwork relating to their work. It's a very interesting concept to think about. Because I see this work and, something like Walker Evans being so far afield than what they were thinking and what they were doing at the time, how they would relate to it now. It's interesting.
Well, a very good art dealer friend of mine in London is always laughing because whenever there's a bunch of artists in a room and then art dealers and everything, somehow the artists always seem to get together and converse about something. No matter how many collectors around, they will always probably want to migrate towards artists to have the conversations. There's kind of conversations that artists have that they sometimes don't have with other people because they make things. So part of this exhibition is about that. Is that what would those conversations be? Maybe Walker Evans would just hate the last read next to his piece. He'd probably just go, forget about it, that's terrible. So maybe I've done something that is you wouldn't like, but oh, too bad. That's the way it goes. He's dead, and we're here, and we're going to create that convergence just to see what happens. It's just an experiment. So maybe nothing comes of it, maybe something comes of it.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.